This is a real treat for us to have Professor Farahany speak with us. She is one of these unbelievably talented individuals that we're fortunate enough to have on the Duke Law staff. She not only has her law degree, she has a master's in neuroscience or something like that, and she has her PhD. There's like a million reasons to hate you. No, really. And here's the thing I like about Nita. Every time I talk with her, she like kind of acts like I'm as smart as she is. Like, and we know that's not really true, but I'm living the dream. So without further ado, I think this is one of these areas that you're going to go, after you hear this presentation, you're going to go, oh my God, what's the future going to be like? Maybe. Thank you very much. Without further ado, Nita.
Thank you, Charlie. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you. One of the things that's great about being at a conference where a lot of people from the military attend is it's so timely, which is great. It's really hard at other conferences to get people back from breaks. So thank you all for being back so timely and sitting down, and thank you for inviting me, Charlie, to address all of you. So, this talk is about enhanced warfare, but at the most basic level, it has always been our goal, and we've always been doing things to enhance soldiers and to enhance warfare, right? So if you think about it, soldiers used to carry swords and they used to carry shields. There was armor that they wore, and that was simply an attempt to increase their capacities and to decrease the risk to them. Likewise, soldiers today carry enhancements of body armor, enhancements of weapons, radios, batteries, all sorts of things that we didn't have previously. And so what I'm going to talk about today, I really think is on the continuum of the things that we've been doing for a very long time. What's different about it is that most of the enhancements we've been doing to date have been exterior enhancements, things that you add on to your body to protect your body from additional risk or to give you the ability, for example, to have night vision through different types of goggles that you might wear. But what if we didn't have to do it just externally? Right? What if we could tap right into your brain and instead create enhancements by just simply reading what's happening through your brain activity and harnessing what's there? That's possible, and that's what some of the technology is that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to focus on three main areas. I'm going to focus on neuromonitoring, the ability to now read and detect what's happening in your brain, and some of the possibilities of being able to use the quantified self. Okay? The second thing I'm going to talk about is neuromodulation. So this is the enhanced self, the ways that we can change your brain to make it sharper, better, faster, all sorts of other things. And the last one is neuro projection, which is what if we could use our brain to be able to operate the world around us, which we do, of course, already, but we are limited by our physical output right now, our bodies. And what if we could just go directly brain to something else? And so we'll talk about some of the ways in which we can go brain to something else right now, projecting your brain into the world without the limitations, and they are limitations, of your body serving as an intermediary in between. So the first thing I will say is some of you might be wondering, okay, is the military really interested in the brain? Like, are they really doing stuff with the brain? And the answer is yes, lots and lots of research experiments are done so. So here's just DARPA and the Brain Initiative. Okay, and if I click on this and just go to the Brain Initiative website, these are all of the, let's see if you can see it. Oh, you don't get to see it on your screen, just on my screen. Anyway, it's a long, long laundry list of different projects that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency is funding. And if you know anything about DARPA, DARPA likes to fund cutting-edge things, and of course, if they're funding them, it's because they have some military value or military purpose. A ton of the funding right now, simply in the regular budget, not even the black budget, is dedicated toward neuroscience. A lot more is happening without necessarily the transparency for all of us to see. Talk to a lot of neuroscience researchers, and they will tell you that a great deal of their funding comes from DARPA. And that's because these things have extraordinary military potential. I'm not going to just talk about the military potential. I'm going to tell you some of the experiments in other contexts, because a lot of the experiments don't necessarily happen within the military or on military personnel. They happen in other contexts so that they have proof of concept of what the implications and applications could be in the military context. And so we'll start with portable EEG. So all of you sitting here right now, I hope, have a lot of brain activity going on. I suspect quite a few of you had some coffee. How many people had some coffee during the break? Great. So you have engaged in some serious neuroenhancement already today. Here is my neuroenhancement, and that neuroenhancement actually does increase brain activity, particularly in the prefrontal cortex region of your brain. Up here, your neurons are firing a little bit faster, and you can learn a little bit better if you had caffeine. For those of you who didn't have caffeine, all is not lost. Hopefully your brain is still working okay anyway. But this is a widely accepted enhancement, which we can now track and see what it's doing to your brain once you actually take it. EEG used to be an incredibly cumbersome thing, okay? Electroencephalography. Every neuron in your brain as it fires has a trace electrical activity that it emits. When your brain fires in particular patterns, those patterns can be deciphered via EEG. And we've used EEG in the medical context for a very long time to be able to pick up things that are happening in the brain, to be able to see whether or not a person, for example, is appropriately under anesthesia, to see whether or not a person has suffered such severe brain damage that they no longer have the appropriate kind of electrical activity happening in their brain, such that we could declare them brain dead, for example. There are lots and lots of different applications. But it's cumbersome. You have to put a whole bunch of sensors, usually 128 sensors, that are each individually placed on the scalp with little electrodes. You have to place them with a little gel, so it's pretty yucky in your hair, and not exactly the kind of thing that you're going to wear in your everyday life, and certainly not the kind of thing that you're going to wear in the battlefield. It also is limited by the fact that there are tons of little wires that are then coming off of these skull caps and attached to something that is reading all of the activity. Again, not that useful. So a number of companies have started to make devices that are far more portable. These portable devices look like this one. This is the most advanced of them, a little headband. Okay? And the little headband has a number of electrode leads. You see a couple right here on the forehead. There are some on the back of the head. There are some up here on top of the head and behind the ear. They've been able to limit down to something like 7 to 9 electrodes, some of them even fewer, although the resolution of them aren't quite as good, to be able to get basically the same medical grade information for certain kinds of things that we're trying to interpret from brain activity simply with one of these little headbands. Okay, well that's pretty neat. The brain is an incredibly complex system. The fact that you could wear a little headband and be able to decipher a tremendous amount of information about what's happening in your brain is great. What are the kinds of things that we can pick up? Okay, well I can't tell what you're thinking by taking an EEG headband and putting it on your brain. It doesn't have the kind of resolution of something like functional magnetic resonance imaging, which actually creates pictures of your brain. Instead, what we've been able to detect is a number of things that are associated with brain activity. Are you anxious? Are you paying attention? Are you drowsy while driving? Are you able to focus for long periods of time? What's happening in terms of brain states for emotion? Lots of different kinds of emotions can even be deciphered and picked up with a pretty great degree of precision. The anxiety and stress that you experience, or your ability to get into a calm and focused meditative state, is something that we can pick up via these types of EEGs. With proper coverage and configuration, when this is put on, we can get a lot of real-time information about what's happening in your brain. Now, that might not sound that remarkable to you, but I'll show you a few of the applications and some of the ways in which that is actually quite remarkable and what we can do. How many of you have ever tried neurofeedback? A couple of people. Okay. So brain training games, these are like the craze right now, right? Prevent cognitive decline. The FTC slapped down one of the biggest of the corporations making claims about neurofeedback, Lumosity, by saying that they were making significant overclaims about what it is that they could do. But it turns out that there is quite a bit you can do now with EEG devices and neurofeedback. So you can get real-time brain activity, okay, what's happening. You can play a game on your phone. These are wireless. They're connected to your phone and through applications via Bluetooth technology. Doesn't require any wires or other devices. Doesn't even necessarily require that the person be present with this. You can send information real-time back to, for example, a command center about what's happening in your combatants' brains at the time that they are on the battlefield or in other context. And you can pick up that information and start to figure out who's paying attention, who's focused, who's not, who's able to concentrate. Is there a significant anxiety and stress that you see across a unit all at once? Can that signal something faster than you can send information back real time? These kinds of biometrics can quickly tell you some interesting information. But neurofeedback, let's talk about that for a moment. So using an application, in order to advance through an application, here's one of my favorites, it's to play golf. Imagine that you could watch an application on your phone and play a golf game just by thinking about it, okay? You're concentrating on the hole, you're concentrating, and you're thinking, okay, I'm gonna get the ball into the hole, putt into the hole. Only when you get your brain into a particular brain state, okay, when you're able to get your brain into the state of relaxation and focus, are you able to actually get the ball to go into the hole. And it turns out after training on one of these devices for a little while, you are able to improve your attention significantly. In fact, this is being used a lot with people who have ADHD and the alternative to drugs. And it turns out about 20 hours of neurofeedback with an EEG device is more effective than most drugs are for ADHD and have longer lasting effects on changing the brain. That's really exciting. There are other applications as well. So what's one of the conditions that most affects people after being in combat? PTSD, right? And PTSD is an extraordinarily significant burden on the individuals who suffer it and on society more generally. It has proven to be intractable for a lot of people, and lots of different therapies that have been tried have failed. Apparently, neurofeedback may be far more useful and far more precise than a lot of different modalities in being able to treat PTSD. Part of it is a brain state, training your brain to get into a particular brain state so that when you recall a memory, the fear and the emotional salience that is attached to that memory is not as significant, which means in the same way that you would focus on getting the ball into the hole, you would focus on the meditative and relaxing state. And you get the information real time about what your brain state is looking like. And by playing a series of games, you're able to train the brain in a way that enables it to be far more effective and far less likely to invoke the same kind of fear associated with it. And brain training enables you to then reconsolidate memories. Every time you recall a memory, think about it as being like an open application on your computer. Okay, those things are in RAM, right, rather than stored in long-term memory. And while it's in RAM, it's far less stable, and it is far more pliable. You then save it onto your hard drive, which is the long-term storage. That process for memory of recall and storage again is called reconsolidation. And every time you remember something and then store it again, there is an opportunity to change and shape the memory. That change and shaping of the memory that occurs is something through neurofeedback that can in fact be incredibly effective. Recent research has shown in a pilot study with Vietnam War veterans with chronic treatment refractory PTSD who trained with the low-frequency neurofeedback protocol, there was a significant reduction in symptom severity after only 20 sessions of an hour each. Okay, 20 hours with significant untreatable PTSD now finally overcome. But of course, there are far more applications than just PTSD. The U.S. Army's Human Research and Engineering Directors, which has the mission of improving soldier-machine interaction in mission contexts, recently sponsored a major research study that looked into using this brainwave technology to monitor drowsiness of drivers and how it affects them by doing things like changing lanes. Now imagine all of the context in which if you could know that a soldier was drowsy while driving, have real-time feedback about that, and then be able to do something about that, how extraordinary that would be. Okay, there's a lot of different technology that car companies are starting to integrate into their cars to do this very thing. Like, for example, a Mercedes-Benz car has driver assist technology that looks to see whether or not a person is drowsy. It does that through a series of cameras and sensors on a car that looks, for example, at whether, looks at the lanes ahead of you and looks at the lines on the street ahead of you. And to the extent that you're making little micro changes that don't typically appear when a person is alert, it will read that information together with some other sensors to figure out that the person while driving is in fact drowsy. It then will put up a little coffee cup picture on the console to say, time for a break, right? Okay. And then we're back to neuro enhancement once again. But same thing, right? I mean, Air Force pilots while flying and drowsy, pretty significant liability. People on the battlefield while drowsy, people while not paying attention. If you could pick up that information real time and be able to monitor and access that information, that can be quite powerful and important information. How many of you wear something like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or something else? Some other fitness tracker? This is the smart crowd who knows better, right? Okay. Well, depending on the audience, there can be a significant number of people who are wearing these different devices that are tracking their everyday activity. How many of you carry a cell phone? Yeah, right, which picks up everything, right? I mean, including microphones that can be turned on and listen into your conversations and cameras that can be turned on and listening in and viewing what it is that you're viewing, but certainly GPS technology that's tracking your every movement, applications that if you look through your privacy settings are tracking far more information than they possibly need to do the job that the application itself is doing. The quantified self is one of the biggest industries that there is today, right? Which is to be able to pick up information about individuals and then figure out how to market to people based on quantification and information about themselves. But that actually can also be incredibly useful in the military context. So the Army Research Lab, for example, recently introduced the Human Variability Project, which is essentially, I kind of think of it as like the military version of Big Brother, the television show, except without all the drama of Big Brother. And what it essentially does is it takes a huge number of the biophysical signals in the body and turns it into machine-readable data by outfitting humans and their environment with lots of different sensors. Like, can we pick up everything that's happening in the human body? The Army isn't alone. The Air Force, Marine Corps, Navy, Special Ops Forces are also funding research to collect biophysical data from soldiers, sailors, Marines, and pilots. And the goal is to improve troop performance, right? The more we can understand the biophysical reactions of what's happening on the battlefield as what's happening during training, the better we are to be able to enhance and use that information to make modifications. One example of the utility of this information. So what would you think if all of a sudden you see heart rate skyrocketing, okay, anxiety levels peaking, and you've heard nothing else other than that, seeing that across a group of individuals? Either something really exciting, right, and fun, like there is a billboard that has something really exciting to sell to you. No, probably not at this level, right? What you think is there's something going on. Right? Now, what happens if you can actually pick up that information across far more people? So you see, for example, a number of civilians and a lot of other people converging on an area with high heart rates, with EEG activity that's starting to spike. What might be happening? Does it make sense to dispatch police? Does it make sense to dispatch some kind of response unit to wherever it is that you see that? Yes. Right? Before we can even consciously vocalize a lot of information, our biophysical reactions tell us a lot about what's happening in a situation. Now, I'll give you a different example. There's a company called MindRider. And what they want to do is they want to take these EEG devices and they want to put them into bike helmets for everybody bicycling. And they show on their little commercial for this a bunch of people in New York City all wearing the MindRider while they ride their bike, and they're able to see retrospectively, like, here's the area that I was the most stressed, here's the area that I'm most relaxed. But ideally, for MindRider, they would like this to be not just in bike helmets, but in far more kind of everyday usage. If we could figure out a way to integrate it with the Apple Watch or something like that, they would like that. And we'll talk about that for a moment, which is can you take it from the brain and the head and move it down to the arm? And by doing so, they hope to take that information and be able to give real-time information and analytics about people's movements, people's feelings, people's expression and anxiety. And that information could be incredibly useful about whether or not a riot is about to happen, whether or not demonstrations are about to occur, and be able to use that kind of predictive information to be able to send and deter different response units. Okay, so I promised you we're going to look at the Apple Watch side of things, right? It turns out you don't just have to put this on people's heads. You can also put it on people's arms because the brain is distributed in many ways throughout the entire body. Okay, the way it's distributed is your body sends and has nerve responses that go throughout every part of your body called motor neurons. Okay, these motor neurons communicate with every muscle fiber in your body, and we can pick up that information to detect a great deal of information about you as well. I went to a presentation recently by a neat company, a startup company out of New York called Control Labs. Okay? And Control Labs was demonstrating one of these little armbands in a pretty neat way. The presentation started this way. He said, we are extraordinary input devices, we humans, but we are really inefficient output devices. Okay? He said, we're limited, for example, by these sledgehammers at the end of our arms. And he said, some people are fortunate enough to be born with 6 fingers on each hand rather than 5. You might think fortunate. The reason he gave that example was to say, we are clearly not limited to 5 fingers, us humans. Those people who have 6 fingers are able to manipulate those 6 fingers just as well as you can manipulate your 5 fingers. They simply have the capacity to be able to use a 6th finger. But why limit ourselves to fingers at all? What if we could have octopus-like tentacles? Right? Once you can figure out how to read motor neurons, can you do a lot more? Here's the additional example he gave, which is, how many of you do most of your typing these days on your mobile device? A lot of people do. I mean, your everyday emails and text messages, they primarily happen via iPhones and other kinds of mobile devices. And so maybe if you're going to write a paper, you're not going to do that on your phone, but if you're going to do something like everyday communication, it's going to happen via your telephone. And the average, like somebody who's really incredibly efficient at doing so can maybe type 30 words a minute. Whereas on your computer, people who are efficient can type about 120 words a minute. And so maybe technology is having us go backwards in some ways. So what he demonstrated was one of these devices where it could pick up individual neurons firing to each of the different muscle fibers in the arm, which communicated with the hand, which meant when you type like this, it could pick up exactly the activity that was happening. And then he stopped moving his fingers and showed us typing by thinking about it with an armband on his iPhone. And then showed us moving a prosthetic arm by thinking about it with far greater precision and far less invasion than the current technologies which embed electrodes into your brain or electrode arrays into your brain in order to enable people to operate a prosthetic device. And so that's terrific for amputees and the possibilities of being able to use information, an armband here that could pick up information and be able to operate a hand. But what does it mean for soldiers? Do we need to be operating these if we could more efficiently operate octopus-like tentacles or other kinds of devices? It turns out it is faster to go brain to a device than brain to hand to a device. And so could this technology be the next thing that would enable that to happen? A number of corporations have already started to use these devices in factory settings, on factory floors, to be able to monitor factory employees to see whether or not they are focused, paying attention, drowsy while engaged with heavy machinery. A number of insurance companies have started to look into the integration of these types of devices, this one and the head one, for truck drivers while driving. and for other people who operate significant equipment. Nissan just announced that they're planning on integrating an EEG headset to have something between self-driving vehicles and the ability to use humans, but more efficiently, being able to gauge their reaction times and use that faster reaction information as input into the car rather than being limited just by what your hands and what your output can do. This has extraordinary potential if we can actually bypass, in many ways, the limitations of the human body. The second major area I want to talk to you about is neuromodulation, right? It's one thing to pick up what's happening. It's another to improve it. Because we can improve output simply by bypassing some of the limitations of the human body, but we can also do things by improving what's happening in our brains itself. Some of you know this drug, propranolol. Some of you may even be on this drug. It's an ordinary beta blocker. It's one of the oldest beta blockers we have, and so lots of people are on this drug. This drug has some other interesting applications as well. So consider, for example, whether it's possible to erase emotional fear that you experience in everyday settings. Okay? There is what happens and what you experience, literally, the semantic content of what happens. And then there is the emotional and fear and other emotional aspects of what happens. Okay? Let me give you an example. There was a recent study that was done looking to see whether or not it was possible to erase the emotional fear response in healthy people with arachnophobia. In this study of about 45 people, one group was exposed to a tarantula, okay, in a glass jar for 2 minutes. Okay, they're pretty safe. It's in the glass jar, except if you know anything about tarantulas, that's pretty terrifying. Okay? And then given this beta blocker called propranolol, which is really commonly prescribed to people with anxiety and certain heart conditions. Then one group was exposed to the tarantula and given a placebo, like a sugar pill. And one was given just propranolol, okay, without being shown the spider. Okay, so we've got the propranolol spider group, the placebo spider group, and propranolol but no spider, so that we could rule out whether or not propranolol by itself could decrease spider fear. They then looked at the anxiety of the people when they were shown the spider the first time, again 3 months later, and finally a year later. Okay, so at 3 different points in time. What they found was incredibly remarkable. Those who got the propranolol alone and those who got the placebo had no improvement in their anxiety. Okay, so it's not propranolol alone. But the arachnophobes who were exposed to the spider and given the drug were able to touch the tarantula, and within days of the first exposure, by 3 months, many of them felt comfortable playing with and holding the tarantula. And after a year, their fear didn't return. Okay, so what is it, and what is it that propranolol is doing? So it turns out propranolol blocks the effects of something called norepinephrine in the brain. Okay, many of you are familiar with epinephrine, right? Norepinephrine in the brain is an essential chemical similar to adrenaline, which enhances learning. So blocking it can block the ways that the memory itself is consolidated. This process I was talking about earlier about reconsolidation, that reconsolidation is disrupted when you block the emotional memory, when you block the norepinephrine. But remarkably, it only blocks the emotional fear associated with the memory, not the semantic content of the memory itself. Meaning, you will remember what happened, you'll remember the tarantula, but not the fear that was associated with it. It interrupts that. And so the recall, the fear, the anxiety that you experience, or another way of looking at this, the PTSD that you might experience, is interrupted by the mere administration of something like propranolol. That's pretty extraordinary. Now, it doesn't work for everybody, and there have been lots of different studies that have looked at the effectiveness of it, and it has been shown to be remarkably effective for some people and not for all. It also turns out that there's a time frame in which it's effective, which is very quickly after you first experience whatever the trauma was. So should we start to include this for soldiers in the field in their kits? Should they be able to take propranolol immediately after witnessing something horrific so that they prevent something like PTSD? Maybe. But what are some of the effects of it? What are some of the side effects of not having fear memories? Is there something useful about inhibition? For example, suppose you witness significant civilian casualties and you take propranolol, and the emotional salience that is associated with that memory is eliminated. Is that problematic for the psyche of individuals? Now, of course, PTSD is a horrific condition, and we have to have ways to treat it. But it isn't so easy and so straightforward that we should be incorporating it into everyday practice, particularly without recognizing some of the consequences of doing so and evaluating those consequences, weighing them against the benefits that they can provide. Of course, we can do more than just dampen your memories. Drugs can be quite powerful in many ways to do many other things. We can also enhance them, right? We can make your brain faster and better. Like a clock, you can tune it a lot more effectively. There are a few drugs that have been used extensively in the military and have been shown to be quite effective. One of them, of course, we know, right, is caffeine. But caffeine has some side effects. What are some of the side effects of caffeine? Jitters. It doesn't actually feel that good, right? I mean, you feel more awake, but there is not a very pleasant side effect of too much caffeine. And that can be deeply problematic if you're having jitters while operating heavy machinery, right? Not exactly what you want. So instead, there are drugs that have been explored to see whether or not they can improve wakefulness, whether they can do much more effective things. Consider the effect of one drug, my favorite drug, which is, my favorite drug for enhancement, which is called Modafinil. Okay? So some of you are familiar with Modafinil. It is also called Provigil. Nuvigil is a time-released formulation of it. And I think it's a pretty cool drug. It was first tested pretty extensively on Air Force pilots, and it was tested in part against caffeine and in part against other kinds of drugs and against placebo. And the results were pretty remarkable. What they found was that Air Force pilots who went without sleep, who took Modafinil, performed on motor IQ test as well, if not better, than the people who had had 7 hours of sleep per night. And then they were able to look at other types of IQs, like performance IQ. And 7 hours of sleep did not do as well as the Modafinil with no sleep on performance IQ as well. And so then, of course, the next logical place to go is to say, well, what about if the person got sleep? Does it improve the person who actually sleeps? And the answer is yes, it does improve the person who sleeps as well. I'll give you a non-military context example of this because lots of people think Modafinil is neat and want to use it for lots of different applications. So there were some researchers who wanted to know, does it work for cognitive performance in an area like chess? Okay, chess players. And so they selected about 40 above average chess players, and they were all men. They all were about the same age, around 37 years old. They had an average IQ of about 130. They had a rating in the high 1600s in chess. If you know anything, that's pretty high. It puts them significantly above the novice level, but not quite in the expert or the master categories. And they then had the players take either a dose of caffeine, Modafinil, methylphenidate, or a placebo before playing a series of 15-minute matches against a computer. They played 10 games in the morning, took another dose of whichever substance it was that they were randomized into, and then played 10 more games in the afternoon. They then had a week off, came back to do it again, and in total they had about 3,100 chess games that they were analyzing. In their first analysis, they found that players on caffeine, Modafinil, or the methylphenidate did about 8% better than those people who were on placebos, okay, which is a significant increase, but not a huge increase. It's not overwhelmingly dramatic. It was enough to see a trend, but it wasn't like, oh, wow, that's enormous. They then started to parse between the people who took caffeine, people who took Modafinil, and the people who took methylphenidate. And they found that the people who took modafinil spent a lot longer thinking about each move that they made. Okay, now that was problematic for the people who already had time management issues. And so some of those players actually did a little bit worse because they ran out of time because they spent so much time thinking about their moves. And so they actually then excluded those people who already had time management problems to look again to see, okay, what would the effect be? And then the effect was pretty substantial. There was about a 15 to 20% increase in their performance level. It would bring, just to give you context, if somebody was around 5,000 in the world in terms of rank, it would have brought them to around 3,000 in the world for rank. It's a pretty big difference. And so what they found was that these people actually do really well when taking something like modafinil. So what did the World Chess Federation do? They banned modafinil. Okay? Calling it cheating. Now, the reason that they banned modafinil is because they wanted to become an Olympic sport. And so they adopted, right. We can all just take a moment with that, right? But they, so they adopted the Olympic Committee's list of drugs which are prohibited. Modafinil is one of the list of drugs that are prohibited given that it improves motor IQ as well as improving performance IQ. And I think that's fine. You can have as a policy or as a rule that in certain kinds of competition that you don't want people to be able to have those kinds of performance enhancements. But not so in the military, right? Those kinds of enhancements are extraordinarily valuable. Why would we possibly ban them in that context? I'll ask you that, which is why would we ban them in that context? Certainly it can improve performance. But I'm going to ask you, yeah.
Well, you said thinking deeper leads to thinking longer. Oftentimes in the military context, you need to make a decision, even if it's not the best one.
Yeah, so we might think we don't necessarily want it for the person on the field, right? You want them to be able to act quickly, and to the extent that it leads to pondering long periods of time, maybe that's a side effect that you don't want. Maybe for strategic decision making, you do want that because it doesn't just lead to thinking longer. It's because you're actually ruminating different possibilities and you're able to see and contemplate and understand far more possibilities in the contemplation. So it's not just that it's taking you longer, you're thinking faster while it's taking you longer, so it's almost like your computing speed and capacity increases. That can be good in certain contexts, but not in other contexts. But what else? What are some of the ethical concerns? Yeah.
Well, like you had said earlier, and we switched from shields and swords to guns, there was more casualties. And so I feel that as we enhance performance here, we may find negative side effects as well as far as
We might.
the
Yeah.
damage that can be done.
What's the difference between asking a person to wear armor versus telling them to take some drugs? Yeah.
It's the Jason Bourne movie. I mean, in essence, creating this idea of a super soldier through drugs and medical enhancement. And now the government has, we've all heard of stories of the government using the military as a guinea pig or, as this, drug role and just continuing that notion is really unethical.
Yeah, we're not sure what the long-term continued use of something like modafinil is. And what happens when you lose the military? I mean, when you leave the military? Pardon?
Why? You don't
Right. You're not going to get your modafinil anymore, right? And it is a prescription drug. And it's very difficult to get a physician to write you a prescription for it. I don't fully understand why. There are some side effects, which is for people who have underlying heart conditions, that can be problematic because it can increase heart rate. It also can cause headaches in some people. And so there are definitely some side effects, but it's more tightly regulated than even lots of other drugs that have similar kinds of side effects. And so part of it is this kind of idea and bias against enhancement more generally, but can a person say no in the military? Is it the same as in other contexts? I saw a hand over there. Were you going to make a comment? Yes.
I was just saying that you were talking about the armor, you can take it off, where in this context you can't. With
Yeah.
the drill, do you need it or are you addicted to it?
Yeah. So we don't know currently of any addiction to modafinil, but there's certainly lots of drugs for which there could be.
They may not be the traditional, what we think of
Yeah.
addiction. It could be that, hey, I
Psychological
want,
addiction.
psychological.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, your sense of self-identity can now be entirely wrapped up in a very different perception of self that you've developed while on these drugs, and suddenly you don't have access to them. Yes?
A couple of things to think about. One, we do have volunteer programs. The Air Force pilots, I'm going to guess, had knowledge of what they were doing.
Yeah.
So there's an example of volunteer program. Second of all, you have soldiers who on a regular basis are willing to do whatever it takes to be stronger, faster, smarter in the battlefield.
Yes.
And you can go to any military gym, you'll see them in there doing everything they can within their powers to do that.
Yes.
So maybe we have to give them the option, not
Maybe.
force it on them.
Maybe. And the question is whether or not the option, whether or not there are some options that make sense to give and some options that don't. And I pose it not to say, I mean, as I said, I love modafinil, right? I have tried it. I think it's fantastic. When you go with prescription, that's legal. But, you know, if you have jet lag and you arrive in a different country and you take a modafinil, it is fantastic. No jitters. You just feel awake and have this clarity that you do not have in other contexts. I often, when I give a talk that includes modafinil, have people come up to me afterwards and say, "Can you spell that for me?" It's good stuff. It's hard to get, all right? But it's good stuff with some known side effects. There is another class of drugs that's being developed as well, which are AMPA. And there are some side effects, as I mentioned to you, increased heart rate as well as headaches. AMPA work differently. They improve functioning of the glutamate within the brain. They don't have long-lasting side effects. I mean, one of the problems of taking something like modafinil to replace sleep is eventually you need sleep, right? Your body needs sleep, and it does a lot of repair, memory consolidation, and other important things during sleep. And so long-term use of something like modafinil to replace sleep is deeply problematic. Part of the value and the hope with AMPA is to increase military effectiveness. A lot of the research studies that have been focusing on AMPA and the development of AMPA have been funded again by the military. It improves short-term memory loss in people suffering from brain diseases as well as healthy people. And you can imagine, as you're training, increased memory consolidation and being able to more quickly assimilate information and remember it can be incredibly powerful and really useful. This is one of the drugs that has been focused upon to do so. But let's move out of drugs for a moment. What does this look like? Headphones? What are all those little spikes? Anybody know what this is? Yeah, in the back.
It's a Halo Neuroscience headset.
Yeah, and what does it do?
It's an electrical simulation of the motor cortex.
Yeah, so this is the next big thing, okay, which is already being used. This is the Halo headset, which is used for transcranial direct current stimulation, okay? So let's forget drugs. Let's just change your brain by zapping it, okay? But zapping it in some pretty precise ways. Transcranial electrical stimulation was one of the technologies that was touted by then Defense Secretary Ash Carter in July 2016 as part of his Defense Innovation Unit Experimental, or DIUX, initiative. Multiple SEAL units have already started actively testing this technology, and it is being used with a number of other special units within the military as well to see whether or not it can enhance and improve performance. The company that makes these brain-stimulating devices, this one in particular, because there are a number of them, is called Halo Neuroscience, as you heard, and they claim it's not cognitive enhancement, but neuropriming. Okay, that's the argument. What they're doing is enabling neuropriming. It was developed supposedly for elite athletes. The headset works by stimulating the brain to enter into a state of hyperelasticity, okay? Allowing users to learn better, learn more efficiently. In physical training, it's been proven useful to develop explosive power in athletes whose sports require vertical leaps or sudden starts, and improving by wearing these during training. For operators, the same system could improve shooting performance. Whatever you're training on, if it's movement-based, neuropriming is supposed to improve movement-based learning, movement-based speed, movement-based accuracy. And so for the incredibly hard training and sleep-deprived SEAL community, it's supposed to offer greater efficiency in training, perhaps allowing you to achieve far more in less time, or to train at the same level and get a boost in performance. Here is there are lots of different, on the Halo website, people who talk about the use in high-level athletes. I'm going to give you one of those examples.
athletes at this point, and everyone on that field, when they step into the field of battle, was very good. So what we're looking for is those small 1% differences that we can grasp and have an edge when we step on the field. We did our own in-house research study a year ago with 20 of our top minor league prospects. We tested them in a number of measures: flexibility, speed, power. The results that we got in the Halo intervention group as compared to the control group were significant enough to really open our eyes to say, hey, you know what? There's certainly something to this Halo, where we're trying to prep these athletes into a training routine by priming them, priming their neurosystems to be ready to accept the different types of challenges we're going to throw at them in a well-rounded training program, whether it's a fine motor skill type of movement that we're working on in the gym, or an explosive power movement that's going to be a multi-joint movement where you're moving a lot of muscles at a very high rate of speed, or even a conditioning skill where we're really trying to get them to utilize the right muscle groups. So when it comes to Halo, we really can harness some technology to stimulate the motor cortex of the athlete's brain, and that motor cortex is highly responsible for how well this athlete is going to learn new movement skills in the gym, or learn a new movement skill out on the field, and possibly can help him learn that at a more efficient level.
I'm Tyler Beatty of the San Francisco Giants. Since I've been using Halo Sport, it really has taken my game to the next level. When you use it over the course of a season, over the course of the day in, day out activities that you're doing, your brain just becomes so in tune with what you've been doing that it can memorize and it can enhance your movements and take you to that next level.
Halo Sport is a wearable headphone that's going to help neuroprime the motor cortex of the athlete's brain before they go in and try and work on a specific movement or skill. That could be the 1% difference that's needed when we step on the field to have a small advantage over our competitors, and often it's the 1% that could lead to that one run, win or loss in that moment.
Now, interestingly, this has been adopted by quite a few sports teams. Some Olympic training has been done with Halo Sport, and it's been, as I mentioned, incorporated into some special training units particularly in SEAL. But the question is, how effective is it? And what are some of the implications of its use? This isn't the only device. There's quite a few other devices. This is one of them, Focus, which I've used. And it's interesting. You can feel like a tingling sensation in your brain as you're putting direct current stimulation into your brain, but we have no idea what the long-term effects of zapping your brain are. I think it's good that I'm still standing here with you, but I have not done it that many times, because whether you call it neuropriming or zap, you are putting current directly into your brain without any understanding of what the long-term implications are. Air Force scientists have been testing some of these transcranial direct current stimulation to improve the information processing abilities of military personnel test subjects. They've been applying this low voltage electrical pulse to certain areas of the brain using TDCS. And in a series of experiments at the Air Force Base, the researchers found that the electrical brain stimulation improves multitasking skills, staves off the drop in performance that comes with information overload, and they found that they can significantly increase performance on test and can keep that performance consistent over time. On every other test, you see a decline over time from cognitive exhaustion, and that cognitive exhaustion can be substantially extended using something like TDCS. It took 4 minutes of testing with TDCS to start seeing, of priming with TDCS, to start seeing a substantial difference between control groups and non-control groups. It's a pretty instantaneous and fast difference in performance, and appears to be long-lasting, because when they've then repeated without the TDCS, right, the tests over time, there is a lasting effect of TDCS on improvements of performance and improvements of memory and improvements of learning. There are lots of researchers that have been looking at whether or not it could be better, for example, than caffeine at keeping military target analysts vigilant, and they have found that it can potentially be far more effective than something like caffeine for keeping vigilance and attention and focus, which makes sense. If you have your brain being zapped the entire time that you're paying attention to something, perhaps you're more likely to remain alert. But the theory is that it's supposed to increase neural activity, and so we're starting to incorporate it, again, without any understanding of what the long-term implications are. And there have been a worldwide group of scientists and ethicists who signed kind of statement, a publication, calling for people, because there's a lot of do-it-yourselfers at home who've built TDCSs and started to experiment them. A lot of gamers have started to use them for video games because it improves their performance on video games, trying to discourage the at-home user from zapping their brains, given that we have no idea what the long-term implications of doing so are. All right, the last area that I want to cover is neuroprojection, the extended self. And I want to give you largely just one main example in this context, although there are many, because I think this one is pretty cool, which is, and gives you a kind of sense of the potential of what we can do with this kind of neuroprojection. So this is, as I was describing, one of those EEG kind of helmets that you can put on that is incredibly cumbersome and hooks you up to a machine. But it is interesting to see what it is that people have already started to do with this. And so first, how many of you are familiar with the Purdick swarm demonstration that occurred? Okay, so I'm going to first show you this and then talk to you about how it links up to neuroscience. So in a statement in 2016, the Pentagon said it had successfully demonstrated one of the world's largest micro-drone swarms over China Lake, California in October. This was conducted in October 2016, and I'll show you the video of it happening. It had 136 Purdick drones launched from 3 FA-18 Super Hornets. The micro-drones demonstrated advanced swarm behavior, such as collective decision-making, adaptive formation flying, and self-healing.
On center line, entering containment area, clear arm. Okay, we're armed. Coastal 3-1, 2 pods armed. Coastal 3-2, 2 pods armed. 3-3, 1 pod armed. 5, 4, 3. Mark release. Coastal 3-1, distance complete.
These drones aren't being individually given an order, right? They're instead being told to conduct broad tasks like observing an enemy airfield. They swarm to execute the mission, flying and adapting by communicating with one another with very little human input. This is essentially they're sharing one distributed brain for decision making and adapting to each other like swarms in nature, which is pretty cool. This is pretty amazing, complex behavior. All right, this is pretty cool to continue watching, but it goes on for another minute. I encourage you to watch this. Of course, this has been built as a surveillance tool, but it doesn't take very much to imagine these small devices doing far more than surveillance. Like, half-long bombs launched to overwhelm a target just by sheer volume, or decimate an enemy, airfield without endangering a pilot. Now, what's pretty amazing, it's pretty difficult to have human operators be able to operate these devices. And so one of the things we need is good human operation of a device like this, or of the swarm. But our brains don't necessarily work like swarms do. And it would be impossible, of course, for us to have many, many, many people each individually operating these different swarm technologies. So what I'll show you here in a moment is the fact that there's some scientists at Arizona State University who have now figured out how to take EEG attached to an individual and can control, to enable a single person to control an entire swarm of drones just with their thoughts, okay, which is pretty extraordinarily remarkable. It allows the person to watch, to pick up their kind of deliberate intentions just through their thoughts alone, and for essentially the single individual to be one with an entire swarm of drones that are out there.
One of the big novelties that we are working towards here in ESU is how you can bridge that gap between humans and robots, and especially when you're talking about multiple robots. There has not been a lot of research on how one single human can control multiple robots.
You have electrodes like the ones that I'm wearing here, and then we're just picking up brain signals. We're using advanced algorithms to decipher what the person is thinking, brain state that the person is in. And then we're using these signals to actually control the robots.
Ready, system ready.
We're using this computer over here to get the signals of the subject. We're sending the signals to another computer that process them. We send the final commands through Bluetooth to the robots.
We started with the idea of human-swarm interaction. We recorded from the brain. We actually saw that the brain really cares about collective behaviors of swarms. And now we know where to record from and what to see from the brain signals in order to decode that to collective behaviors for air vehicles and swarms of robots.
You're having the brain signals from one side, and then you're having all the algorithms that are actually controlling the robots, both in terms of where they should go and in terms of how the motors will react and how they will work together.
The goal for the next couple of years is actually have now a hybrid team of both ground vehicles, mobile robots, and aerial vehicles, quadrotors, that they will collaborate to each other. Now we're controlling 3 to 4 robots. We want to do that with tens, even go to 100 robots. Both the quadrotors and the mobile robots we have, they have local sensing, so they know the environment and they can understand where they are with respect to each other. And what we are doing here is actually building new control interfaces so you can control their inner distance, they control their density so that they don't crash on each other, but again, collaborate towards a bigger goal.
So imagine now for a moment that a single individual
One of the big novelties
can operate just with their brain a swarm of drones, a swarm of robots, okay? Drones to begin with, broader, more collectively, and what's interesting is this is not just through conscious, deliberate thought. Okay? A lot of the way we think is through intuition, and one of the really significant limitations of brain AI or human AI interaction is the limitation of having to have deliberate conscious thoughts to be able to manipulate and operate something like a robot. And so instead, what a lot of researchers are doing is figuring out how to take intuition and more subtle electrical signals from the brain and use those more subtle electrical signals from the brain, called things like error-related potentials that are firing in your brain, to be able to operate different robots. Another example of this is to be able to figure out, for example, robots if they're trying to do a simple task like sorting or target identification, okay? If we try to train the robot through literal conscious demands, it becomes very cumbersome, and oftentimes you can't describe that. You can't describe what it is that makes you very good at target identification and verbalize it, because a lot of it is more subconscious processing. And some of the more remarkable research is enabling picking up this subconscious, more intuitive decision-making and being able to operate robots by doing so. The potential for that is you can have a robot that is integrated with a human, acting based on human intuitions and enhanced with robot capabilities. You can also have things like prosthetic arms or robotic arms or other types of devices that you are operating not through conscious thought, but through intuitive thought. Okay? And that's what the potential for these types of technologies are. That's where we are already, is in pilot studies for this kind of remarkable technology. The things I want to leave you with and leave time for us to have some more questions are these questions about how we think about some issues like responsibility. What are the ethical challenges that we face with some of the remarkable advances we're making in neuroscience to be able to enhance soldiers and enhance warfare from within rather than through more sophisticated armor? Do enhanced soldiers have to give their consent for any type of enhancements? If so, how much consent? Can they refuse ethical types of, can they refuse enhancement based on ethical grounds like religious beliefs, for example? Are there limits to how much or in what ways we should enhance? Could you use brain monitoring information in a court-martial proceeding against someone? Would that information be used against prisoners of war? Can we use it for interrogations? To what extent are people who are given the neuropsychopharmaceuticals and having altered behaviors responsible for their behaviors? To what extent are other agents who've given those types of neuropharmaceuticals the ones who are ultimately responsible? There are a lot of unintended consequences that we don't know yet, of course. There are lots of unintended consequences that every enhancement we've had over time has had. What does it mean when you put swarms of drones out through human intuition? What does that look like for warfare? What does it look like when humans are now hive minds that are operating AI? What are the implications for warfare? What are their implications for society? And this question of informed consent, you know, people who are in the military are willing to do extraordinary things in service of our country. And that's amazing and incredibly, it's an incredible gift that we're all given in society. But what duty do we owe to ensure that the types of questions that are being asked, the types of opportunities or the types of enhancements that are being offered are ones that can be entered into with true informed consent? And does informed consent really even mean the same thing in this context? I think there is an unfortunate history of subjects being forced or misled into participating in lots of different kinds of research experiments. We have no idea what the long-term implications of certain types of brain enhancements and alterations are. And we don't know what the implications of having real-time brain monitoring at all time mean with respect to privacy, mean with respect to revealing a tremendous amount of information about yourself that you might not otherwise reveal. And so we have to ask the questions about what are the implications of incorporating all this technology and ensure that we're comfortable about it at every step, not just because of the promise it offers, but in full understanding of some of the perils and some of the ethical quandaries that it raises as well. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and I know that there must be some, so why don't I open up it now to questions? Yes, in the back.
What are they doing in terms of studying, who is studying the long-term effect of the halo thing? I'm imagining, is that working? I'm imagining little like rat halo things or something. Are they studying it on some other creature
to
figure out what
we're certainly doing, they don't quite look like the little headsets like that. You can actually just, hook up some electrodes, so they're not quite as pretty for the rats. But yes, we've done and are doing a lot of animal studies. One of the things that we found in neuroscience, and one of the struggles right now, is that particularly a lot of things like mental illnesses don't replicate well in animal models. And so understanding the long-term effects in animals, we may see things like certain kinds of decline in brain function or other things like that. But some of the more pernicious effects like mental illnesses and mental health conditions that can result, we can't model well in animals. And so we don't have any data right now on long-term effects. And most of this technology is it's very new, right? And so people, maybe more like me or gamers who occasionally will use these devices rather than every day while training for years at a time. And so we have no idea. And we won't know until it's longer term. Yes?
Hi, yes, Mark Nevitt, former Navy JAG, now a fellow at Penn Law. Outside of the pharmacotherapy context, could you just touch upon the latest research about mindfulness meditation and its ability to enhance performance and also repair PTSD? What's the latest research saying?
Yeah, so Neurofeedback is the latest on it, right, which is using EEG for it. There's been a good deal of research that has shown that EEG mindfulness, using EEG as a way to do mindfulness rather than pure mindfulness, is far more effective, in part because you get kind of data feedback in a way that it's much more difficult for people to do. And you don't quite know if you got to the right mind state when you're meditating on your own, whereas you can get data to see whether or not your brain activity and pattern has actually changed. And so it's sort of a hack to be able to do meditation and mindfulness better. The jury is still out on how effective mindfulness ultimately is for long-term improvements in concentration and intention and decreasing anxiety. But there's, I think, an accumulating amount of information that suggests particularly EEG modulated neurofeedback is effective for improving performance across a vast set of issues.
In PTSD, repairing?
And in PTSD, yeah, for reappearance. Yeah, it does appear to be, with 20 hours of training, more effective. It's pretty limited studies so far. There haven't been wide-scale studies in EEG, and there haven't been great randomized double-blind control studied, which is harder to achieve in this kind of population. You don't really, it's not possible really to randomize people into these two conditions of PTSD, but nevertheless, you can start to randomize against things like drugs and neuropsychopharmaceuticals, like how good is EEG compared to propranolol for being able to treat PTSD. And there's some promising results. In the back.
In the fields of ethics and law, since there's so much advance going on in the technology area, is there anything like a parallel development of either through an organization or through collaboration starting to deal with the ethics and the law?
Yeah, so I bill myself sometimes as a neuroethicist, and there are a group of us who bill ourselves as neuroethicists. There is an international organization called the International Neuroethics Society, and I'm a board member of that organization where these issues, whether in the military context or in other contexts, are issues that we're grappling with. The advances in neuroscience are incredibly promising, and I'm extraordinarily excited about them. But I spend most of my time thinking about the and then what, right? And what are the implications for law, and what are the implications for ethics? And there are a number of people who are doing the same.
Thank you.
Back corner.
At what point, how do you deal with the ethics of the question? Because the research is different from the possible usage.
Yes.
And I ask this especially in the context of biological weapons, because we see there's a failure because you have to go after the pharma, that there is no system of inspection, whereas it's not true for nuclear or even chemical weapons.
Yeah. Each of these are complex problems, many of which have analogies and other things that we've done in time, right? Every new technological development has a predecessor technological development that we have thought about and considered what the implications are. Some of this is differences in kind rather than differences in degree, which requires new tools to analyze it, but we have a lot in our arsenal. For example, we at Duke have a master's in bioethics and science policy, and we have some of the students who are really focusing on the neuroethics side of things. You can use the principles of bioethics to be able to work through a number of these issues, and then new tools are being developed to kind of think through them context specific. But we can draw on a lot of past examples and a lot of traditions from philosophy and bioethics to be able to start to address some of these issues, which at the global scale are going to be unique and different and have to be addressed. But I think figuring out how to enable progress in science, but to do so responsibly, is an essential part of what I think a lot of us do, and I think it's an essential part of the conversation we as a society need to have. Yes?
I'll wait.
Okay.
With the idea of the neural mapping, is there a way, I'm sure some of the defense attorneys are freaking out inside, is there a way to shut out some of the neural output to determine what kind of thoughts are coming through and
Yeah.
figure that out? Because the brain's so complex.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say this, which is, you know, in the past when I've presented here, I've talked about some other forms of decoding. And they're, you know, using something like functional magnetic resonance imaging decoding, you can start to decode things like thoughts and visual images in a person's mind, which are very different than what you can decode here, which are broader brain states, but not specific thoughts. So I think defense attorneys should be a little bit less worried about this. Nevertheless, in the same way that there's a case right now where the prosecutors are seeking the Alexa that's in a person who's been accused of murdering his wife's house in order to hear what happened in the house that day. If you're wearing a device like this and we can see at the time that we think the murder occurred a significant peak in the physical indicators that you were killing your wife, that could be probative information. And so there are certainly neural indicators that would be valuable and useful, and whether or not you can filter it, the answer is not the individual. The algorithms pick up different things, and so it depends on what algorithms we choose to incorporate. In the military context, we're going to want a pretty broad set of algorithms, but in other contexts, you could have more use-specific cases where it could be more limited. They're picking up broad brain data. It's what the output looks like on your iPhone or on your app, but you have to pick up all of the brain data. You don't necessarily have to report all the brain data. All right, I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So I see you've had your hand raised for a while. Yep.
Hi, my name's Elsa. I'm one of the Lens scholars.
Yeah.
Thank you. We all currently enjoy a lot of military research benefits like GPS, Snapchat, things like that. And obviously the point of privileging these technologies to the military is to make someone who is superhuman and above human and has an advantage. My question is, what would it take, or do you have an idea of when this kind of device would be available to normal people? As a law student, I would very much enjoy a zapper.
Yeah, you can get a zapper. So you can go to Halo and order one. You can go to Focus and order one. The FDA has not currently limited access to these devices, and they try not to make medical device claims in order to avoid FDA regulation. The FDA has their eye on it, but they haven't actually prevented it, so you can get it. You can go to halo.com, you can go to Neurofocus, you can go to Emotive and get one of these headsets and practice neurofeedback. I've thought for a while that it would be fun to, there's one set that has little cat ears, and when you're not paying attention, the ears go down. And so I've thought about trying to get all of my law students to wear those in class, but they don't seem that excited about that prospect. So, you know, you can get them. I don't know if you should. Modafinil, I mean, we can talk about that later. But, you know, long-term use of transcranial direct current stimulation, I'm not sure. But, you know, wearing one while studying for your exams, can that improve your memory? Probably. I just don't know at what cost. All right, one last question right here.
I Will Cawley, also Lens Scholar from UNC. I wonder if has any of the research thus far been in actual, I guess you could say, adversarial field testing? Because I could imagine a number of efficiency drawbacks to this technology that comes from, you know, we've had observations where sometimes human error and inefficiency actually increases success as opposed to taking away from it.
Yeah, so EEG headsets have been. They have been tested in interrogation settings on the person being interrogated to see whether or not we can pick up anything useful and decode any brain activity that may be of utility. I don't know of other adversarial uses for, I mean, like I wouldn't necessarily want to put transcranial direct current stimulation on the adversary if it really does work and makes them better. And of course, there are a lot of neuropsychopharmaceuticals that we've tried. One of them that I didn't talk about today was oxytocin. You know, the cuddle hormone that we all have, that cuddle hormone that increases trust We've attempted to do things like use nasal sprays to have the person who we are interrogating be exposed to something like oxytocin, or put it into the air filtration system while the person who's going to do the interrogation is not in the room, so that they don't start cuddling. But increase their likelihood of being able to, of trusting and forming the bond that might lead to them providing some information. So we're definitely testing a number of neuropsychopharmaceuticals. We're always looking for the truth serum that could enable us to better interrogate people, and perhaps with less, force, with being able to overcome some of the conscious barriers to accessing information in another person's brain. I will be here to answer questions, so I know that I didn't get to everybody, but I also want to respect the fact that we have somebody here who's going to enforce time correctly. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Nita, that was absolutely fantastic. I think you can see what a gift it is to have Nita here at Duke Law School. Really, really tremendous. One of the things that you've given me some hope here, Nita, because maybe I can get as smart as you. And you talked about some people do this at home. I stuck the power cord to my computer in my ear, and I'm feeling pretty good now. So, okay, plan of attack is 11:15, 11:15 hours. Be back in here. Pick up your lunches. Be back in here. And we're going to have our luncheon speaker, but it's okay to continue to eat your lunch during the presentation. And Nita's very graciously agreed to stay around because I think everybody has about 6,000 more questions. And my power cord's there if you want to give it a try, Thank you very much.
Mine was like, we oftentimes, with a lot of this technology, we think fog before something to be overcome. We also get a lot of use out of fog before it's cool. Trying to overcome. I wonder if it's kind of the question of, if you have two playing chess,